zones. And as Said had said, in culture and imperialism and in Orientalism, all you scholars who are here from Calcutta University, Jadavpur, etc., that I've met, I think you will probably find some of the answers in today's panel. So without further ado, I'll throw the question first at Amitav and then at David. I was speaking to Pico Iyer, another favorite of Calcations, readers here. And Pico this morning mentioned that if he was possibly on this panel, and he knows Amitav rather well, was that he would ask the question not about whether we need a new history or whether we need these other voices now, but his question would be, do we need an old history at this point of time? So how would you encounter that?
Well, I think it's absolutely obvious that we need many kinds of new histories. You know, when I was writing my trilogy, the Ibis trilogy, and I was doing the research for it, I actually have a book coming out later this year on my research for the Ibis trilogy. I mean, I realized then, you know, I'd studied history in college. I'd always had an interest in history. I've read every kind of, you know, history about India. And yet, I discovered that, you know, so much of what I had been taught really was completely beside the point. I mean, it was not necessarily a cover-up or something, but it was oriented to something quite different from what was actually happening in India in the 18th and 19th centuries. I mean, essentially, this is the period when the opium trade became the most important driver of the Indian economy. And yet, it's something that you're never taught about. And one of the reasons for that is something that the two Davids have explored very, very well in their book, which is that so much of our ideas about history are geared to this notion of progress. You know, and progress dictates a kind of teleological version of history. Whereas now we can see with climate change, we can see with England now, I mean the UK now has a per capita GDP that's going to be lower than that of Poland. We can see that in fact, you know, what we actually have to try and explain is this terrible trajectory that we're on.
Absolutely. And thanks for the segue you've made for David to come in, because David Wengrow, with his co-author, David Graeber, in their own way, slightly, probably, you know, understated, but after speaking to David Wengrow here, I do realize they are both activists for ecology. And if we look at the kind of work and the kind of interest that David Wengrow has, that would be a nice way to open the score on, you know, global warming, issues of how the indigenous people kept the planet in a better shape than we do. And that's where I think histories from below, histories from the indigene, whether it's the Cherokees, whether it's the Ojibwe, whichever North American tribe that you talk of, and their histories would appeal to us and get us away from just thinking of the materialism that comes with this idea of progress. So David, you've just come back from Canada recently, and you've been in touch with the indigenous writers there, et cetera, and people who are working on archaeological sites. What do you have to bring to the table today?
Thanks. Well, just to go back to the initial question for a moment, I was thinking, just listening to the end of the last panel, that when people use this phrase, human history, or a history of humanity, I think that phrase belongs in the same category as world literature, or universal museums. As was being discussed, world literature, when you take a close look at it, turns out to be Western literature with a few add-ons here and there. In my field, in archaeology, there was a lot of discussion at one time that there should be these things called universal museums. Museums that ought to have a bit of everything from all over the world. And of course, guess what? When they drew up a list of them, they all turned out to be in Europe and North America because they already had all that stuff because of their particular role in the world over the last few centuries. I think it's rather the same with the idea of human history. I don't believe we've ever really had a human history that treats all human beings on the same footing or on a level playing field across the divides of the literate and the non-literate, the urban and the non-urban, or what used to be referred to as the civilized and the uncivilized. So my co-author David used to have a joke because there's a great interest at the moment in moving beyond the human into a post-human vision of the humanities and the social sciences and of history, where we begin to think, we begin to decenter the human and think about plant life, animal life, the Earth system. And he used to joke that rather than being a post-humanist, he thought of himself as a pre-humanist, in the sense that we haven't done the first bit yet of actually seeing what it would mean to write history in a way that doesn't dehumanize a large portion of the world's population. I think that was a joke to a large extent. I don't think those two projects are at all incompatible, actually. I think they flow into each other in practice. So that would be my basic take on the question.
So that would turn me in a way to the kind of work that Amitav here has been doing. I'm specifically thinking of not his more recent work on the mountain, but I'm thinking of the Hungry Tide. And the image of the Anthropocene, where humans think they are the best thing that ever happened to the planet, and caused, perhaps, the pandemic. In the Hungry Tide, I think what occurs to the reader at many points, Amitav, is that the way you ferret out, excavate the indigenous histories that are the repository in people such as Fokir or as Moina, and the way you bring it and showcase it as possibly something that educates someone who is trained like the cytologist Pia. So let's have your views on that.
Yes, the question of indigeneity in the Sundarbans is very complicated because actually the Sundarbans it wasn't even really settled until the late 19th century when this Englishman, Sir Daniel Hamilton, he had this sort of frontier idea, make the desert bloom sort of thing. And he started moving in lots of people from various places. So, of course, people have adapted to the landscape and become sort of naturalized. But I don't think there's any sense in which we can say that they were really indigenous to the Sundarban. But, along those lines, when you're in the Sundarban, certainly the ideas that, let's say, you get from like baules are like shamans, about history and so on, they're very strikingly different from our understandings. And over there, I must say that I think really one of the most amazing parts of this book, The Dawn of Everything, by David Wengrow and David Graeber, is the first section, where they really show that all these European ideas that we were always told came from the Enlightenment, equality, freedom, etc., actually were borrowed from indigenous Americans. I thought that was the part of the book. Well, there's so many parts of the book that just blew me away. but this was one of the most important among them, I think. I think it's a really major contribution. But what's interesting in relation to what Julie was saying about Canada is that actually, and once I remember you telling me this yourself, that these ideas are actually completely well known to Native Americans.
Well, they are, and I don't think they would have come as a great surprise to any of the writers of the early Enlightenment. I mean, what's happened is interesting and a little counterintuitive, where actually all we're arguing is that ideas that European writers themselves attributed to indigenous peoples were actually theirs, which is not altogether that strange. Just coming back to this concept of the Anthropocene, I'm curious to ask Amitav something about that. I mean, I've been reflecting on this, and I think the Anthropocene is an important concept, obviously, because it's a warning light. I mean, it alerts people to the critical stage that we've reached and the culpability of our entire species in that climate crisis. But it also belongs firmly to the kind of stage thinking and block thinking that we spend a lot of time criticizing in The Dawn of Everything, although we don't explicitly discuss geological timescales. Yeah, I guess I was curious as to, how far I mean, the concept's been around a while now, a good number of years, and whether you feel on the whole it's doing good or not.
Well, the Anthropocene, for those of you who don't know, is really the discovery of a stratigraphic layer which was made of human-made remains, like plastic, chicken bones, etc. So they've actually become a sort of strata of rock. So certain geologists have proposed that we speak of the end of the Holocene, which was the last 10,000 years, and the start of a new era called the Anthropocene. But this term is very hotly contested because, as it wasn't all humans who contributed to this. It was mainly affluent Westerners who really, created this huge anthropogenic fallout. So, others have suggested Capitalocene, which to me doesn't really make sense because in the modern period, the Chinese and the Soviets, I mean, they weren't capitalists, but they were industrializing on a massive scale. So I think you could also speak of an industrialocene or whatever. But I think the important part there is just the stratigraphic bit, And I think that's where it's important that you recognize that this is a marker, that humans have become a geological force in their own right. But on the whole, I would say it's a term that one should avoid, especially if you haven't plowed through all the literature.
But I do agree with that. Perhaps we use it very flippantly. But the concept, I think, appeals to a lot of the new generation, young scholars, who are very aware of how we have desecrated, decimated what the planet was by our generation, by the generation before us. And I'm talking about theorists, Amitav and David, such as Dipesh Chakraborty, who make us very aware that the reason for the ice caps melting hasn't happened just in the last 50 years. It's taken a long time, as you point out, and it's in need of being viewed as once again, maybe, looking at what we have created by way of history to do with capitalism, to do with greed, to do with consumption and materialism. So, yes.
Sure. But again, one of the problems with this whole Anthropocene approach is exactly as David was saying, that it subscribes to this evolutionary model of history in some sense. And one of the really interesting things about their book, again, is the way they've taken on these ideas of like Jared Diamond and the guy who wrote Sapiens and so on. And, they're sort of very evolutionist kind of idea about how history progresses. And what you've shown is that it's nothing of the kind, that people switch between models, and people have always asserted their own agency in choosing between different models.
So here, before I forget, to link this to a bit in your book, which is quite striking, if you would like to tell us about how the feathered serpent, the temple of the feathered serpent, how it was seen to be almost a Foucauldian idea of power and the worship in a temple, and then how it was broken down and made into public housing.
We've gone to tiny details now.
So, would you say that this is the way that perhaps human beings have not stuck to one sort of thinking, but in turn have maybe demolished what was there a generation ago?
Yeah, it's something that came up in conversation with Dr. Banerjee the other day, that we're, I think, almost sort of hardwired to ignore or to unsee certain kinds of transformations in human history. That's rather vague, so actually it's a good thing that you've introduced something as concrete as the Temple of the Feathered Serpent. But, there's a lot of talk when people write about the deep past, and you have a civilization with monuments and in heavy infrastructure, tens of thousands of people living in radical proximity, and then it stops for some reason. More than likely it will be described as a collapse, as opposed to, for example, a revolution or a social change. And again, it rather plays into this idea that conscious political change, the ability to actually consciously construct a society according to a certain set of ethical preferences, and then change your mind and unmake that society and create something in a different form, which in the book we refer to as the third freedom, the third of three basic forms of freedom that we try to identify, is rarely entertained or is thought to be specifically an outcome of the European Enlightenment and Montesquieu and l'esprit de loi, the idea that it is only through that tradition. I mean, it's an extraordinary claim when you reflect on it, but I think it's really quite pervasive. So the building that you refer to is in Mexico, in an ancient site called Teotihuacan, and it is indeed one of a number of huge structures built in that ancient city around the year 200 AD, which indeed is then desecrated, closed down. The facade is completely hidden, boarded off by a platform. And the citizens of this enormous city with at least 100,000 residents change direction completely and redirect their labor from monumental construction projects into the building of housing. We were joking the other day, that historians get upset when you talk about public housing or social housing in the ancient world or in non-European contexts, but they have no trouble talking about the state in all of these contexts. They're all modern concepts, but I don't see any reason why they wouldn't apply in a case like this, where you have an urban grid. So instead of all that human work being sucked into building pyramids and temples, you have the construction of this huge orthogonal grid covering the entire city and housing pretty much all of its residents in really quite sumptuous apartments.
Fascinating. Thank you, David. Amitav, I was just thinking, in the last 50 years, we've seen a lot of indigenous or hyphenated people who are métis, which is a mixture of either Anglo-Canadian, Anglo-American, and the indigenous blood. And many writers, such as Thomas Green with Green Grass Running Water, Thomas Findlay, who rewrote the aspect of the Bible and the patriarchy as seen in his book, Not Wanted on the Voyage. There are many writers like that. And I want to ask you, do you think you can relate that to your associations, research, contacts with writers pretty much all over the planet on trying to revise, rewrite, revisit history through another lens.
Yes, certainly. I think that's been an interesting thing for me. I mean, to try and see how the world looks when you look at it from a completely different perspective. And I must say, I should tell you all that inspired by their book, The Dawn of Everything, 3 months ago, is it 4 months? I actually went to Teotihuacan, and David put me in touch with some archaeologists, and they took us over the place. And it was such an amazing thing to see that these giant pyramids, on the one hand, and on the other, these apartment buildings. I mean, really very nice apartments, where they lived in considerable comfort, And of course, that's the kind of history that you never get told about, That's the kind of history that's absolutely sort of obscured. And exactly the reason why we do need new histories of humanity.
Well, the other thing it shows you, again, as we were discussing the other day, is that people can flourish and one can have really mass prosperity on a large scale in a cultural system which bears no resemblance to capitalism or any early form of capitalism.
In fact, another point that you make in your book is that this whole idea that somehow, which again is celebrated by a lot of people, that there were hunter-gatherers who were egalitarian. I mean, what you've shown in the book again is that there is no such stage. I mean, in fact, hunter-gatherers do many things, completely different things.
There's a funny book called The Royal Hunt. I think it's just called The Royal Hunt, about the obsession of rulers and elites throughout the entire history of Eurasia with hunting. And, there's an alternative genealogy there, which I think, doesn't fit the bill of saying, well, there is a mode of production, it involves wild resources, and then it gives way to agriculture, which produces inequality. But in fact, you look at, pretty much all of the top echelons of every dictatorship that's existed. They love getting out there shooting, and this sort of chasing things,
So, if you were to give us the nut of your book, what are the 3 things you would say that come through about a new history of humanity in the book?
I couldn't help comment that it was really his book that had the nuts. I would simply say to anyone who hasn't read the book and might be considering doing that, to conjure up in your mind the broadest possible vision that you can of human history. The whole thing, from the origins of our species up to whatever it is that you think made us what we are now, and then consider the possibility that it's all wrong entirely. And that's not anybody's fault. It's the result, I think, of a genuine paradigm shift, which is enormous, and it's going to take many generations to actually fathom the implications. What we're doing in the book is really just trying to break as much of that information as we can out of the ivory tower of academic journals and that sort of thing, and conferences, and just try to present it in a way that allows us not only to deconstruct, but also to ask entirely different questions. I mean, I very much agree with what was said before about the catastrophic trajectory that our species is on, and what it means to be on a path to absolutely certain catastrophe and not be able to get off. And, I think if one looks at the great sort of questions that have been asked of human history on that really large scale, they're not those kind of questions. They're the questions of another era. They were urgent and they were radical at their time. They were urgent during the English Civil War. They were urgent in the years leading up to the French Revolution. The origins of inequality. What is the nature of human society without government? These were radical questions then, but I think we need radical questions for now which inevitably will be different.
If I can add something there, it's so interesting, you know, especially when you look at disciplines like, say, economic history, you know. They always work their way backwards. So that, you know, if suddenly people are monetizing their economy, that's an incredibly good thing because it's one more step towards capitalism or industrialism. So one of their big questions is, why didn't China industrialize? Why didn't India industrialize earlier? And I think, you know, now at last we begin to see it's because maybe because the Chinese and Indians understood that this was a pathway to hell.
Yeah, I've been reflecting on this this morning, actually. I mean, it's so strange the way that most of human history is written, as if we were the only species that couldn't actually think forward. I mean, they've discovered, you know, like rats in a maze, you know, sort of running around in this maze that was there before us, thinking that we're making decisions towards the future, but just sort of, actually they've now discovered that even rats are more sophisticated than that. It's very strange.
Well, you know, no matter what we say, the fact still remains, as most of us who are in the academy know, and this is a question for both of you who are scholars and writers. The canon is very reserved to taking in new thoughts about how we should look at history, how we should look at what happened. We're still very Eurocentric. And the academy in North America, in Europe, doesn't deny that. So as a post-colonialist, that all of you young people here who are attending would think, I would imagine, how do we rethink of our history, a new history of humanity, and push the envelope for those new histories to be considered, accepted, and revalued?
Well, the first thing I'd say is that it can't be a new history of humanity. It has to be a new history of the interconnections, the enmeshments of different things. And that certainly has become absolutely clear to me through just studying the opium poppy. You know, you were talking about intentionality. And actually, you know, the history-making powers of forests have been written about at great length. And we see that forests think ahead. They communicate with each other. They know, you know, what they're going to do to prolong their lives or whatever. And in the same way, you can discover this same sense of intentionality in the opium poppy. You know, I mean, the opium poppy has outsmarted humans every single time. They just defeated the most powerful army that humanity has ever known, that is the US Army in Afghanistan, you know. It was basically the triumph of the opium poppy. Today, the opium poppy is actually more dominant than it has ever been. I just don't think that we can think about these or that we can think of humanity without also considering fossilized forests, which is what fossil fuels are, you know.
So I don't know if any of you are familiar with the book that I'm about to mention. Ben Okri, latest book, Hallelujah for Every Leaf, pretty much echoes, chimes with what Amitav has been saying. And I'd like to turn my attention to David to have the last word before we open it up for questions. So David, as an archaeologist, talking about fossils and the past, the hoary past, do you think there is hope for us in all that you have studied of the millennia? Do you think there's hope for us as a species?
Well, if I can link this back a little bit to some of the other things we've covered, a new project that I'm working on, which is not a piece of writing, it's actually going to be an exhibition, an installation that you can interact with. And I'm doing it in collaboration with a group in London at Goldsmiths College called Forensic Architecture. And it's about these cities in what is now Ukraine. cities which existed 6,000 years ago and which were completely forgotten to history. They didn't leave behind a written tradition. They were as large as Mohenjo-Daro or any of the early cities of ancient Mesopotamia or the Indus Valley. And they were rediscovered in the 1970s, initially by Soviet archaeologists. And it ties into this question both about hope and about the Anthropocene, because one hypothesis about these early cities is that the lands which they sit in and upon, which are some of the most fertile soils in the world, these are the so-called black earths that Timothy Snyder wrote about in his book Bloodlands. Soils which they've been the breadbasket, they fed the democracy of ancient Greece, they've attracted colonizers and empires from that time right up to the present conflict. Actually, what archaeology is currently suggesting, although it's still just a hypothesis and remains to be really tested, is that these Chernozem, these black earths, are actually not natural. They are anthropogenic, humanly produced soils, like the famous terra pretas of Amazonia, but a very different sort of process. So what's being proposed by an archaeological team in Germany at the University of Kiel is that these incredibly fertile soils are actually a byproduct of these early cities, which is extraordinary and suggests an entirely different genealogy for the whole concept of the city, rooted as it is in notions of extraction and exploitation and inequality and the draining of the earth's resources. Here, potentially, one has a form of urban life that actually invigorated the environment it occupied. So it raises all kinds of wonderful questions and possibilities, which I think are hopeful, or at least interesting. And what we want to try and do in the installation is exhibit them without, pretending to know more than we do about the current state of knowledge, but simply to open up those kinds of questions for reflection.
So, David, what is this black earth? Scientifically, what is the content of this black earth? Is it human refuse which has evolved over the centuries and millennia?
No, that's why it's different from the Amazonian anthropogenic soils, which are, it seems, largely the product of humans leaving behind all sorts of bits of this and that and then moving on. In this case, it's all about worms, believe it or not.
Wonderful.
But I will leave you to contemplate the worms.
Amitav, would you like to have the last word before we open it up for questions?
Well, what we do see is that increasingly, say, Amazonia, this great rainforest, was actually not a forest. It was like a garden. It had 9 million people, if not more. So that whole story that we've been told about Amazonia is, and then we see that also about Australia, we see that about the United States. And, we see that here in our country. I mean, so many of our forests are actually maintained actively by Adivasis. Yeah. And unfortunately now, under several very powerful forces, mining, certain ideas of governmentality, what's happening is that the Adivasis are being thrown out of their land on this utterly mistaken idea that, expelling them from the land will somehow make that forest pristine.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
This is one of the most shocking things that we see happening in India today.
On that very thoughtful note, I think we'll open up the Pandora's box and see what worms come through there. Go ahead.
It's not working. It's not working. Okay. As a lay person, the everyday newspaper and the television coverage basically focuses much more on inhumanity than humanity, at least here. And so my question to Mr. Ghosh is, as a scholar, do you think that average people, general people, are more interested in the history of inhumanity than the history of humanity, because unless there is a everyday diet of meaningful, constructive stuff on mass media in the most populous country of the world, we cannot expect things to actually translate for the better of the earth, whatever good work the scholars may do. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I think there's no doubt we live in a society that's become completely necrophiliac. It's just sort of absorbed with these incredibly psychopathic and sociopathic forms. But I think what we have to remember is that just day before yesterday, the doomsday clock was moved up to 90 seconds from midnight. We are closer to absolute catastrophe than we've ever been in the whole history of humanity. And I think people are not aware of that. They're not taking it into account. So, it's like one of those situations where they say, the turkey is very happy. He thinks, oh, wow, there are these nice people feeding me all the time. And then suddenly one day there's Thanksgiving, and that's the end of the turkey.
David, would you like to say anything?
The question did make me reflect on what passes for good scientific scholarship in the academy. I think there is a tendency to assume that if you write about violence and warfare, you're somehow more scientific. And that if you take seriously, a major theme of our book is precisely this boundary between what is considered serious and what is considered play. And I think we don't take seriously enough things like peace. Yeah. What is the process by which societies make peace? There is a vast literature on how societies make war.
Yeah.
And of course, it's the bad news that sells papers. So, not being facetious, but that's what really happens. That's the truth on the ground. Question, please.
There is a premise that India's industrialization is a pre-requirement for mass prosperity. Can we have mass prosperity without industrialization?
Go ahead.
Well, what good will mass prosperity do for us if day after tomorrow we have no water, if we have no food? As you know, Delhi is going to run out of groundwater in a year or two. Bangalore is going to, already we can see the sort of incredible suffering that this mass prosperity is imposing upon people. We forget all the displacements, we forget the people who are being shoved off their land, whose lands are now absolutely uncultivable, because at one point it was thought that the Green Revolution would create mass prosperity. Now we see that this was just another bag of, a crock of nonsense that was sold to us.
And look at Narmada Bachao, what happened, to the dams that have been constructed.
And I think it's also worth distinguishing, as I think Bruno Latour often did, between prosperity and growth. Growth in a sort of economic sense, yes, clearly industrialization and growth in that particular sense are intertwined inevitably, but prosperity, I think, is a much broader concept. Flourishing is a much broader concept, and of course it raises the question of what we mean by that, and who actually has a say in deciding what it would mean to be prosperous or to flourish in more than just a purely economic sense. And obviously I agree that it's very hard to see much prosperity around these days in that sense.
Do we have time for one more question? Yes? One more then.
It's working, sir.
Hello. Sir, my name is Shoifuddin Ahmed and I am from Kollani. I want to know from Sir Amitav Ghosh. Sir, I am a big fan of yours. And sir, I am feeling extremely privileged to have attended the session. And sir, I have also purchased a book, Sir, The Great Derangement.
What
sir,
is your question, please?
Sir, my question to you, sir, what propelled you to become an acclaimed writer, and what message would you like to convey to the aspiring writers like me? Thank you, sir.
I think the message that I would want to convey to you at this point is that you have to engage with the reality that is around you, you know, not the sorts of fanciful stories that are told about, you know, how we are going to become the next superpower or whatever. You know, just look at what is really happening in our country. Look at the environmental constraints that we see all around us, and you'll see a very different picture. And it's really urgently necessary for all of us to engage with those issues.
I think we'll have to call it a day. We don't want to push our luck. The organizers, is it 6?
They said 10 past 6.
Did they? Wonderful. Then we have 2 more wonderful questions. One here. Yes, please. Go ahead. Yes? We will have 2 or 3 more. Go ahead, Harish.
Mr. Ghosh, a question for you. What do you think will be the human history of Sundarbans? The human history of Sundarbans over the course of history, the kind of damage that we are doing to the area, as well as to the wetlands of Calcutta. You know.
I was in the Sundarban a couple of days ago, and I must say I was just appalled by what I saw. You know, on the one hand, you know, there's electrification everywhere, which is a great thing. But this electricity is being used to play music all day and all night at top volume. So there's sort of festive music, there's temple music, and there's absolutely no quiet at all in the islands. You know, in Sundarban, before there was such a sort of tranquility that is now completely gone. You know, obviously I didn't do a survey, but I can say that I could see that the bird life had become very much catastrophically diminished. You know, I remember a time when if you went up the Hooghly, every now and then you would see these giant stingrays coming out of the water. You never see those anymore. Even fishermen don't see those anymore. You know, we are really creating an absolute catastrophe over there. I just can't tell you. I mean, you know, there are like hundreds of tourist boats which go up and down all the time, dumping their plastic and their things in the water. It's just horrifying to see. On the other hand, you know, it does give the local people another source of employment, which is certainly a good thing.
That's always the catch-22, isn't it?
Sir, I will keep my question very short. As a teacher, I always found your novels very complex. But as a student, I used to find it very easier. But while teaching your novels is always a great challenge. So since ma'am mentioned Hungry Tide, since I'm teaching it in masters, how do you want your novels to be taught without the privileges of too many theories? How do you want it to be taught?
Oh my God, I can't answer that at all. I would never teach my novel. And fortunately, I've never had to teach my novel. I have no answer for that.
You can't escape those theories. Unfortunately, Calcutta University has us by our ears, so I can see your problem, absolutely. There's a question here.
Thank you. I had a question for David. So when you began your research into this very, very ambitious and wide-ranging book, did you already have a sense of certain gaps that existed in the existing world literature? And was this something that you were privy to with your co-author? Or were these gaps sort of well known in the field, and that there are others like you who might be contributing to the topic? That's one thing. And the other one is whether, you know, since your book has overturned much of the understanding of what the past was, I would imagine, is your field of history like other fields of like international relations is hugely divided between revisionists, post-revisionists, realists, right-wing, left-wing? Is your field similarly, your book, would it now, since you've overhauled the work of a lot of existing scholarship, do you anticipate some sort of critiques or divisions in your field?
Yeah, no, I mean, if we weren't getting critiques of our book and if we weren't getting pushback, then the book would clearly be a failure. I mean, I think it's reassuring to me that we do get critiques. I've yet to see one that seriously makes me reevaluate the book's arguments. And some of them, frankly, a little on the ad hominem side, which is always interesting because it suggests you have touched a nerve. You know, I think that's an important thing too. Going back to your first point, that was really very important for us, was the realization that, you know, I think David and I, within our own fields of anthropology and archaeology, thank you for calling me, what was it, a formidable excavator? But I've never been called that before. But I think actually we will have done plenty of excavation. We would both be regarded probably as generalists or comparativists. Actually, my job title in London is Professor of Comparative Archaeology. So we were actually pretty shocked to find out in conversation with each other how little of this new knowledge was even familiar to us working in neighboring disciplines, you know, up the road from each other. And that realization, you know, to what extent academic knowledge has become compartmentalized and over-specialized within regions, chronological periods, technical specialisms, and in a way that's why the book is rather on the big side, because we found that a lot of the basic work of synthesis around hunter-gatherers, around early cities, around non-Western forms of democracy just didn't exist. So we found ourselves increasingly trying to do it ourselves, and that's why the book grew exponentially.
If I can just add something to that. The two high-profile critics were Arjuna Padurai and Anthony Appia. And actually, as you pointed out in your responses to their articles, it was really quite shocking how ill-informed they were about archaeology.
Yes. Those were the only two I responded to in writing.
I'm afraid, I think I'm getting quite straight messages that we should wrap it up. Thank you so much for being a wonderful audience. And thank you, Amitav and David, for a wonderful conversation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Amitav. Thank you, David. Thank you, Julie. We can never wrap